So to all those who are watching, welcome. Our session today will be on what's the evidence on evidence-based policy, reflections on knowledge mobilization in provincial rural policy. And our presenter today is Ashley Whedon. So today we have Joshua Barrett as with us as our moderator. He is a senior policy analyst in the Department of Natural Resources within the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. In this current role, he works to shape public policy related to industrial development. His research interests include economic geography, regional development, public policy, democracy, governance, and labor mobility. Joshua holds a Bachelor of Arts in Geography and Political Science and a Master of Arts in Geography from Memorial University in Newfoundland. I am now going to pass it on to Joshua.
Thank you, Monzaline, and welcome everyone to our lovely webinar. As Monzaline mentioned, my name is Joshua Barrett, and I'm currently a senior policy analyst with the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. But perhaps more importantly, today we have Ashley Whedon, who will be doing the majority of our presentation. And Ashley Whedon is involved with a number of different capacities, but she's currently a PhD student in the Rural Studies program at the University of Guelph, where she's working with community capacity building, knowledge mobilization, and public policy renewal. But before then, she's been doing a lot of work in rural Ontario counties as an award-winning rural innovator and doing a lot of interesting things. So you can certainly check her out online, and we'll be sharing a link shortly where you can find more information on her. But just before she dived into the presentation, I just wanted to provide a bit of a context, I suppose, as to how and why we're doing this webinar, and I guess kind of what led us here. And so last year I was appointed to as the Rural Policy Fellow within the Rural Policy Learning Commons, and because of my connection with the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, my involvement with provincial policy, and my previous involvement with the RPLC and my education. And since becoming the Rural Policy Fellow, it's becoming increasingly evident, certainly from the academic side, where people are very much interested in how they can disseminate their research effectively to government policy to help shape provincial rural policy. Certainly in my role as a policy analyst, we're always looking for effective ways to meet our objectives in delivering policy and programs. But there's certainly a bit of a disconnect between the two at times, almost a bit of a paradox where government might be moving towards certain areas in policy, and instead of looking at academic research, we might be looking at different jurisdictional review or what have you. And from the academic side, maybe we're interested in trying to look at ways to engage government. Perhaps the bureaucracy provides a bit of red tape in order to effectively do that. And certainly there's a lot of legitimate reasons and a lot of different ways that this interesting paradox where we find ourselves. And something that I'll be sharing in a few moments in the chat box is a recent blog that I read on the London School of Economics ongoing blog, which actually kind of talked about this issue about university research engagement with local and regional policy. And they identified 4 difficulties when it came to doing engagement, which includes limited financial, human, and time resources, complex bureaucratic processes, too many engagement channels, and narrow forms of performance evaluation. And I think that's certainly true from a government standpoint, where perhaps governments might not be constantly looking at ways to improve what it is they're doing. However, perhaps research suggests, there's new or improved ways that we can actually deliver this program or policy. And so I suppose the underlying question that we find ourselves is, how can academia and government collaborate to develop rural policy? But I think it's important to take a step back and determine on a Canadian context if and whether provincial governments actually used evidence-based policy for their initiatives, and what are some of these interesting dynamics that we currently find ourselves in before we could really understand how this collaboration can effectively work. So with that in mind, I will stop talking and I will let Ashley take over, and she will be discussing this briefly in our webinar today. So Ashley, continue, and thanks.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Munzaline. Thanks for that great setup. I think we tend to think of knowledge mobilization and certainly evidence-based policy in a somewhat one-directional way, and that's from academia to policymakers. And I think it's perhaps the next step and the next part of the work that we'll be doing on this will be a curious way of looking at that back channel around how that feedback loop works in the other direction or in other directions. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see I've got a few slides with some interesting points on them. So let me just get that going. And there we go. So alternate titles for this have floated around, but we did settle on what's the evidence on evidence-based policy. I sometimes jokingly call this, or friends and colleagues of mine have jokingly talked about this in terms of kind of the long live evidence-based policy. Evidence-based policy is dead. A eulogy for evidence-based policy, a wake for evidence-based policy, or certainly just reconsiderations of what this means. So it may not be the most uplifting webinar you've ever attended on the future of provincial rural policy. But there are a lot of really interesting nuggets that have come out of some work that I've been doing with Dr. Ryan Gibson out of the University of Guelph. As an interesting note, this project is a subcomponent of a provincially funded research initiative that's funded through the OMAFRA UOG Research Partnership. So it's a little bit meta in that regards in terms of it's a funded project by a policy shop to look at whether rural policy is actually moving the needle. And this subcomponent was really about how are policymakers getting their evidence? Are they getting their evidence from research bodies? What kind of evidence they use? And what that means for knowledge mobilization in rural policy development. So just a little bit of context on the whole notion of evidence-based policy and policy making. I really like the notion from Reimer and Bowman around public policy being anything that governments do or do not do. I think we sometimes forget that our decisions to not do something, whether that's purposeful or neglect or just omitting that from an action, is still a public policy decision. So policy can be the active creation of something. It can be a program or a tool that we implement to guide a certain end, but it can also be decisions that we don't make. Sometimes those decisions happen by analysis paralysis in terms of waiting too long to make a decision. Sometimes those decisions happen through benign neglect, and sometimes they're active decisions to say, you know, we're not going to go down that road. Additionally, policy analysis can be for policy, so for policy development, or it can be of policy, so in terms of policy evaluation and what we're looking at. In both cases, that process is meant to provide alternative choices for policymakers, and that being the alternative to what we're already doing. So there's an assumption built into policy analysis that we're already doing something. You know, remember, it's something we do or do not do. What would the alternative to that action be? This kind of activity is actually relatively recent. It stems from a lot of the large-scale planning and public financial management processes of the 1960s. And interestingly to note, in discussions after presenting sort of some of this work to OMAFRA last week, I was speaking with someone who had been with the ministry for quite a long time, who said that in the mid-'80s, there were 2 people in the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food that had the word policy in their title. And by the time he had retired in sort of the mid-2010s, late 2010s, there were something like close to 90. So I think that in and of itself speaks to the mass expansion of this activity of policy analysis, or it could speak to a couple other things. It's a growing field. It's also something sometimes that I know, having worked in government myself, that sometimes we become policy analysts because no one knows what else to call us. And sometimes we think of policy as sort of this catch-all thing. So that kind of rapid expansion of the field of policy analysis is really interesting to observe over time and what that means for this field as it's grown. Crucially, we often focus on the macro level processes of policy development. So we tend to look at, when we're looking at policy analysis as a field, when we're looking at the literature regarding policy analysis, the focus tends to be on the institutional processes or the broader organizational relationships that go on. So between policy and academics, or between policymakers and academia, between industry and government, between different levels of government, rather than the micro level human activities that actually go into building policy. It's something that's done by people. So something that became very clear when we were doing a review of the literature around this is that we tend to focus on the engine, on the actual machine of policy, and not on the mechanics that are maintaining it, building it, putting the fuel into it. And this creates problems when we think about the sort of common sense notion that if policy is being done by people, the relationships among those people matter, whether those relationships are internal or external to government. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of how we study policy on a more formal level as academics, and how we actually do policy as government or practitioners. So what is the evidence on that process? I think that we, on both sides of the coin, we need to remember that policy neither starts or ends with sort of straightforward decisions about efficient allocation of resources. If that were all that were to it, we wouldn't be kind of as obsessed as we are with things like today is budget day. And I'm happy that you're attending this rather than paying attention to the endless stream of thought pieces that are going to come out of the Canadian political media about that. But we need to really acknowledge the goals and aspirations and the fact that they're competing against other things, as well as the sort of small p and big P political influences that go into policy development. There are also very few studies that assess the practical importance or the relative importance of the different enabling and challenging factors of knowledge mobilization in public policy. So we may be able to categorize, as what Josh mentioned earlier, different kinds of challenges to effective knowledge mobilization, but we're not getting into the nitty-gritty around which one of those factors is actually more important than others, if any of those are. We also tend to get a little bit blurry on what literature we focus on or how we decide whether or not we're doing effective evidence-based policy. And a lot of the literature up until recently focused very heavily on health research and on medical evidence-based care or evidence-based health policies, which is very different than broader community development processes where there may not be as much of a straightforward answer. Typically, a lot of the contemporary problems that public policy is seeking to address are wicked problems. They tend to be very complicated, and when you pull one thread or you implement one decision, a million others spill out. And when we're fuzzy about what we mean by policy, evidence, policymakers, policymaking, or the specific institutional workings of that policy cycle at a given jurisdiction, it becomes very difficult to nail anything down. We can't seem to settle on what we mean by any of these things. And that creates not only definitional problems, but evaluation problems of understanding what's actually going on here. So this is a line I like to use when we talk about evidence-based policy. I also use this when I talk about innovation, is that, you keep using this word. I don't think it means what you think it means. And that speaks to that note about being really fuzzy on what we mean by evidence. Who is evidence? Is it community-based knowledge? Is it evidence created by academics? Is it scholarly-based evidence created in partnership with industry? Is it certainly just industry demands? Anyone that's involved in public consultation or public participation will tell you that trying to determine what evidence counts and whose story gets told is fundamentally an incredibly difficult problem. However, we throw out the word evidence-based policy, or that phrase, I guess, as if there's a common understanding for what that means. And if we don't understand what we mean when we refer to evidence, there's no way we can get to a common definition for what that means. So this is a bit of a tricky situation to put ourselves in terms of understanding what do we actually mean by this process. This is a way we've formulated, this is the way it comes out in the literature, however, is when we talk about knowledge or the creation of evidence, tends to look at sort of more information in terms of more contextual or qualitative data, community stories or embedded knowledge that we might try to access in a particular way. Data, which we tend to think of as more quantitative and sort of math-based or mathing about people as economists are wont to do. And the creation of that tension between more qualitative and more quantitative evidence leading towards this ultimate process of the creation of knowledge and how we integrate those things to create a story about what they mean. Because information and data or data and information, however we want to put that on their own, unless they're contextualized and put into an effective way of saying, what does this actually mean? They're still just kind of floating out there in ether. There's another challenge we run into, though, when we start telling those stories is that at the root of evidence-based policy is that everybody wants to be the first to go second. And we're seeing this come out, as Josh mentioned, when we talk to policymakers about where they're getting their evidence from. I cop to this as a long-term former local government civil servant, that there's a long history of R&D, but it's more a rob and deploy than research and development, in that we look at what other jurisdictions are doing and we say, well, it works there. They've already done the work. We're just going to wholesale adopt that over here, whether it's a policy or a program. And this, of course, rests on some pretty shaky methodological grounds. In a lot of ways, we're not entirely certain, or can never be entirely certain, how that policy or program was developed, where it came from, what the assumptions were that were baked into that, what evidence that other jurisdiction used to create that policy or program. And there's a lot of assumptions that what worked there will work here. This is really, really difficult when we start talking about place-based development, when we start talking about sort of adaptive and nuanced policy. And at this point, as we're replicating whole systems across the country and across communities, we're really setting ourselves up for a really difficult conversation around, well, who made the first decision? So what does this all mean for Canadian provincial rural policy? And what did we do on our research team to kind of take a look at this? So as a subcomponent of the Making a Difference project, which is funded by OMAFRA, we interviewed policymakers from Ontario, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Some notes on the limitations there, where the interviews were conducted last summer. We had difficulty kind of nailing down some people for interviews that in different jurisdictions. We also ran into kind of problems where there are provinces where we couldn't locate anybody that would specifically be able to talk to the development of rural policy. And this speaks to the changing way in which provincial governments are actually tackling rural policy. This is interesting to note in juxtaposition of the new federal minister for rural economic development. In some cases, we have rural policy housed within extractive or sectoral-based portfolios. In some places, it's off to itself. And in some places, we really struggled to find someone that could just point us in the right direction to conduct an interview. These interviews were included with former deputy ministers, former senior civil servants. They included junior policy analysts as well. They included people sort of midway in the organization, as well as policy advocates from external organizations that are primarily interested in rural issues, agriculture, and industry that relate to rural development. Across all of these interviews, we came to 5 key challenges, which sort of mirror the blog that Josh mentioned earlier, but that really reinforce the findings we've been having in the literature. The first of those being the difficulty in actually accessing research evidence. Some people asked that, well, how do I even get research evidence? Do I just go to the University of Guelph's website and type it into the search bar at the top and it'll take me where I hope to go? And that's, that in and of itself speaks to a challenge in terms of how you get information out to people. The other one was, if I don't know who's conducting research on a particular topic, I don't know where to even start. And some of it is, I don't know what I need until I need it. So how do I go about finding it if I haven't established those challenges already? The second one, which is related to that, is ineffective knowledge translation tools. So I think there tends to be, I hesitate to say laziness, but I think well-intentioned a simplification maybe is more of the term on both sides of the coin that say, distill this 3-year project that's produced numerous journal articles into a 2-page briefing note for me, and that will work. And in reality, what was coming out is that neither policymakers nor academics in the literature find that an effective knowledge translation tool. So I think just recontinuing or repatriating this idea of distilling things into an info sheet, and that will be the way to do it, is really something that we need to look at and take a really hard look around how we're doing knowledge translation. One interesting thing to note is that several of the interviewees mentioned the importance of hearing about new findings in different forms of media. So if you're driving to work and you have a long commute and you listen to whatever your news station of choice is, and you hear someone give an interview with a subject matter expert, just as you're going into a policymaking meeting around a particular issue, several people kind of noted the influence that has on their inclusion of that item on their radar for decision making, on the notion that this might be someone they could follow up with later, or on the decisions that they make in and of themselves. This is challenging for a number of reasons because it really forces us to think about who's getting platforms with broad media distribution channels. How are they getting those platforms? When is that happening? What is the connection between media and evidence? And I think, we live in a really challenging time around what do you believe in the media, and a number of people that are coming at that from various angles. And this is a really challenging thing to think about in terms of who has the ear and the time of policymakers, whether they're senior decision makers who are making recommendations to elected officials, or junior analysts who are thinking about where to even look for information to build a briefing book that goes up the chain. This is a really interesting and challenging aspect of that process. Third, the misalignment between academic research being conducted with policy needs. So several interviewees kind of brought up this idea that even in projects where provincial ministries or government agencies were funding research, that sometimes the research that was produced by that process wasn't what they were hoping they would receive. So whether that was a case of miscommunicated goals or funding was received and the policymakers were cut out of the process until the very end, it was here's your report, or whether it was a case of the research that was being sent to them, if it wasn't funded, seemed to kind of come out of the blue and really didn't resonate with the issues that policymakers were wrestling with at the time. This creates interesting questions personally for me in terms of what I'm looking around on who gets to decide what gets funded and what gets investigated. This is challenging, presents an interesting challenge and an interesting opportunity for a number of ways. Industry-funded research tends to get a bad rap for being biased or being pushed in a particular direction. However, we know that policy agencies are not inherently neutral or any more neutral than industry-funded research. And so the goals of publicly funded research are still aligned with both small p and big P political goals. So the alignment between questions being asked and answers being provided seem to create a lot of frustration on policymakers' part. Following from that as well as the slow research cycle versus a fast policy cycle. So this subcomponent is actually part of a 3-year research project. Several research initiatives that happen on broader issues are, on a 10 or 15-year horizon. Some are even longer than that. And the difference between the results that might be produced in 18 months or in 2 years, because we know that academic circles and cycles, as well as the creation of new knowledge, tends to benefit from the creation of slow knowledge, a lot of iterative back and forth with colleagues, a lot of presentation and slow refinement, versus a policy cycle where you might get a note from your minister's office saying, I need recommendations on this particular issue within 4 hours. If you don't have an established relationship with researchers or with subject matter experts who are able to give you the knowledge or the insight or the evidence that you need in that short of a time frame, which I would argue, I think that's an impossible, almost Herculean task, we end up with this huge misalignment where the thought notion almost becomes, why bother looking, because it's going to take so long to produce the answers that I need that by the time I get the answers that I need, I won't need them anymore. That we'll be asking different questions. So this creates challenges around how do we produce future-oriented research, or research that's answering questions that we can anticipate that might be coming, rather than questions that are have been percolating for the last 20 years, and how to kind of do a little bit of fortune telling over what those might be, anticipating future policy needs. Finally, the lack of political will to implement research findings came up in every single interview. This is something that I think gives a lot of civil servants, so non-elected decision makers, a lot of heartburn. I know it's something that many researchers kind of see the political implications of things and get a little bit shy about that. But a perfect example of this, and there are several happening right now, are things such as climate change. We have tons and tons of evidence, but the policies that are being developed don't reflect the evidence that's been published for 60 some odd years. So a notion around that be, if we can't get it right on the fate of our planet, how are we going to get it right on smaller issues? This is a challenge on not only the big P political will of the difference between knowledge mobilization for the civil service and how we work with administrative employees versus elected officials, but also small p political will. So the machinery of policy development is actually designed to reinforce the status quo. It is incredibly resistant to innovation. It is incredibly resistant to change, and actually very resistant to implementation of iterative policy development based on evaluation. And a lot of this has to do with the maintenance of, in some cases, 18th and 19th century institutions against an increasingly compressed time-space continuum of modern and contemporary policy challenges, as well as changes in the way we work versus the continuation of norms around the way we develop policy. This is something that really can't be ignored, because the importance of that last point relates to the four preceding points. If you don't have the organizational will or the leadership to align research interests, to tackle difficult, challenging questions and incorporate the answers, to assess and evaluate the effectiveness of policy, and to really pursue that as a goal, the rest of it doesn't really matter. So this is something that everyone struggled with, and certainly if someone has the answer to this, we could all live happily ever after, and I would love for you to share it with me in the Q&A later. As a side note, it was interesting to talk to policymakers who had recently completed a graduate degree. They had a different take on the ability to access research evidence and had been sort of inoculated to that culture. It was also interesting to speak with senior decision makers around the change in the way policy is made over time, and the changes that they've seen towards favoring a more technical or macro level analysis instead of an embedded or community oriented policy development that was really nuanced and meant to address the micro concerns of particular areas. So these are sort of broad challenges that have grown over the last 70 some odd years. So how do we tackle all of this sort of gloomy evidence on evidence-based policy and reconsider what it means for rural policy? So we know that timely access to good quality and relevant research evidence is actually critical to building policy. However, what's most critical to that access is developing relationships between policymakers and the people creating evidence. So these opportunities to connect with folks before you need to connect with them are really, really crucial. And it's not done through a briefing note, it's done through that building of a relationship, ensuring that people are attending conferences, that they're having meetings, that they're connecting on priorities that matter. In a world where our time is incredibly precious and getting smaller by the second, as well as in an austere climate where many provincial employees are no longer funded to go to conferences where they might access new evidence. That relationship building is both more difficult and more important than ever. As we're developing these relationships and we're creating these policy alternatives, it's important to remember that we're trying to limit the failures that come from that disconnect between what a government can actually accomplish and the conditions in the communities they're seeking to serve. Effective knowledge mobilization is really about creating the bridge that's meant to facilitate a continued relationship that avoids that breakdown. The challenge being that we haven't really gotten there, despite the fact that we say evidence-based policy or evidence-informed policy or iterative policy. I think the move to lean and agile and all the different names that we use for policy shops in provincial agencies around the country is effectively at this point rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. We're not actually changing the policy cycle in terms of how issues are introduced, the questions that are asked, the way we seek evidence, and the way we evaluate the effectiveness of that knowledge mobilization. Even the mass funding of publicly funded research, if it's not actually incorporated into policy and then evaluated for its effectiveness, isn't really doing much. So whether we want to sort of color it in different shades at this point is sort of tackling the surface level of an issue that's refusing to budge. So we need to develop clarity and consistency in terms of what we mean by evidence, where we're getting it from, different kinds of evidence. Perhaps that's a typology. I know different organizations have done similar work in terms of public participation, and perhaps there's space for that in terms of the policy creation cycle around different levels of evidence or different types. But that creates a lot of challenges in terms of what evidence gets prioritized. Is it always the case that academics are right? I don't think so. And sometimes academics and scholars struggle to effectively feed evidence created in concert with a community back into that community. So we really need to be looking, as Josh mentioned earlier, at the flip of that feedback loop as well. We also need to look at how we're matching the program goals of research with the policy instruments that are actually implementing that research. If the goal is simply to create recommendations, then, you know, in a lot of cases we're achieving that goal. If that goal is to move the needle on particular issues, then we really need to develop instruments that effectively match that goal. And a lot of that comes down to a tighter definition of terms, stronger expectations of what the process is meant to include, and greater relationship building between policy and researchers. So all of this is to say that we're really not going to save the world by email, and I would say we're not going to save the world by dissertation or briefing note or 2-pager or 10-slide deck. A lot of the tools that we create, thinking that we're trying to move the needle on getting things in front of people, are actually working at cross purposes. I read, I think, somewhere that the average attention span is now somewhere around the 3.5-second mark. And certainly as someone who is always glued to her phone or some device, I know that even my personal focus as someone who is deep in the woods of a PhD, I have to set up all kinds of mechanisms for which I can pay attention to particular things for a long enough period of time for them to sink in. And so when you think about people whose schedules are incredibly demanding, we have to be very conscious of the fact that in a lot of cases, that personal touch or that knowledge of somebody as someone that you trust is what will facilitate the delivery of evidence in a way that's going to have an impact. This creates all kinds of mechanisms that are problematic related to privilege, related to access, related to institutional systems that keep some people out by design. And so part of that means we need to widen the circle as well. You really do have to go over and say hello before you send someone a briefing note. So we have a lot of time left for questions. And I know Josh and I wanted to have a little bit of a chat before we open things up to folks as well. But there's a lot more information about the project at ruraldev.ca. You can find information there. I'm also super Googleable. I'm super findable. And I talk about this stuff a lot. And I'd love to chat more if there's insights that you have. The next step in this kind of process is to really look at broader relationships in terms of rural policy across the country, to dig a little bit deeper into some more of those interviews and pull things out, and hopefully conduct some more interviews with policymakers. So if you're on this webinar and you'd like to be included, I'd love to hear from you. The real sort of final invitation to this is the fact that this has been a somewhat depressing thing to talk about, but also I think for me, and certainly some other people that I've been working with on this project, is a real invitation to reconsider what we're doing and why we're doing it. There's no doubt in my mind after completing these interviews and talking to a variety of people who are passionate about knowledge mobilization, that the desire is there, the interest in doing this effectively has never been more important or greater, I think. The problem is that we really have to get honest with ourselves about what is and isn't working. And we can't do that until we start to dig into things a little deeper. And once we acknowledge those issues, it creates all kinds of space to do things differently or do things better. And one of the ways in which we can do that is through these opportunities, through stuff like this webinar, where we have the opportunity to sort of bat around ideas around saying, the system is flawed. I won't say broken, but it has problems. How do we address some of those flaws to better ensure that the decisions that are being made to govern our communities, to affect their futures, are based not only in contemporary need, but also in sound evidence. So I'm gonna quit the talking head thing for a bit and open it to Josh and to the floor to have a bit of a chat around some of the issues that have come up. So if you've got questions, please put them into the Q&A box. And we'd love to have a really good conversation.
Thank you, Ashley, for this very timely presentation. In hindsight, I kind of wish I left my video on, because you would have seen me doing this and doing this and doing this for the entire presentation, but it's really, really good information, really useful, and I think it's definitely something that we need to hear and discuss about in moving forward. As I actually mentioned, there are ways that you can ask questions. There's a Q&A box there below. There's also a chat box, so by all means, please feel free to send them along. But as a holder of a camera and microphone, I will take the liberty of asking the first one or several, depending on people's interests. So Ashley, we've talked about this a fair bit in the past, over the past few months, and I guess one of the questions I'm interested in is, has your research findings resulted in any discussion on the evolution of policy and program development, and whether this was due to formal or an informal evaluation of a specific policy or program which warrants modifications, or if new policy development and the way that people get evidence is just because of the political will? I don't know if that, I mean, that might be a little off the core of what you're doing, but I guess, in terms of the evidence on policy development, is it mostly just based on the political will of the day, or is it because people found the best and greatest next thing that they really want to implement in their organization?
Right. So we did ask people for examples of something that a project where they thought they had utilized evidence really, really well, things had worked really, really well, and examples where things, where the wheels had kind of started with really good intentions and didn't quite get there. And I think that going back to sort of some of the earlier points, where we focus a lot on a specific policy and not the mechanics of how that policy was created, right? Not the personal relationships that have gone into the development of it, not the structures that supported or challenged challenged its creation, and what the importance of those factors were. And so when we look at the so what factor, which is that I call that the rural smell test, right? Which is so what? Is this actually going to work? Did it work? Who cares? And then that tends to be the end of the discussion, rather than can there be something that we tweak here? When it comes to specific policies, I think that there are aspects of specific policies where evidence gets leveraged in a stronger way. And those tend to be specific industry-based policies or specific sector-based policies. But when it comes to broader rural policy, we really struggle for a number of reasons. That one is the conflation of agricultural policy or industrial policy or extractive policy with rural policy. So we figure if we've got an effective agricultural supportive policy and we're using evidence created by researchers and in conjunction with industry or producers, and producers are happy, then we've got effective rural policy. If we've got an effective mechanism for doing that, then it's done, check mark, we're good. The other challenge with that is that we're ignoring a broad range of other ways in which that might influence broader community issues in terms of rural development. Also on top of that is policy development by checklist or by quote unquote gold standard is really, really problematic. Look to what's happening in different jurisdictions. We have to be careful to look at the context in which that's happening and the way in which that policy has been developed or evaluated. So an interesting example, in my personal, aside from knowledge mobilization, a lot of my work is focused on rural innovation systems and innovation policy. Europe is now doubling down on the Europe 2020 smart specialization policies and encouragement there. But they haven't actually affected, the original Europe 2020 hasn't finished yet. And so the evaluation of how effective that's been is incomplete at best and sort of sketchy at worst. And so we have to be careful when we're saying, okay, that's the gold standard in innovative rural policy development. Based on whose standard? Based on what? I think it needs to be very careful in terms of how we go with that. And then finally, just the last point, the checklist notion of if I've done this, then it's effective. If I've done this, it's effective, and we can move forward. Doesn't encourage a lot of that deeper relationship building that we've heard in the interviews and that we've read in the literature is really critical to nuanced and adaptive policy development. So if you're just trying to cycle through the different steps in the process set out by often a generalist branch that may not have specific embedded rural contextual knowledge or a knowledge that's important for understanding the implications of these policy decisions in a real way, we're at risk of kind of repatriating a lot of neoliberal structures that don't do well for people. They don't tend to have good outcomes. And that's sort of a result of the new public management school of public policy development, where if you're a good general manager or policy analyst in finance, you're going to be a good general manager or policy analyst in agriculture or in health. We know from a lot of other studies that that's not true, right? We know that from a common sense thing that you sometimes need some of that deeper knowledge around, if we do this, it will have X, Y, and Z externalities that we might not be able to imagine unless you actually have experience in seeing that happen. So I think we have to be very, very careful about what mechanisms we use to institutionalize evidence-based policy and where they're coming from. That's been some of the interesting stuff that has come around the mechanics of it.
I think that's really good points, and I think certainly when you consider the whole idea of using the checklists, it can certainly be problematic, and just the idea of kind of what you were saying is in the corporate knowledge and investing really in your the capacity that you have within the public sector. I mean, heaven forbid that this be some sort of new phenomenon that people consider, right? So I think that's all good commentary. We do have a few questions online now that I will pass along to you. So this one comes from Alison Stringer. She says, Kia ora from New Zealand. Ashley, do you have people who have the role of mediators between policy and research/evidence? For example, chief science advisors, engagement, and outreach staff. And do you think that might help the flow of knowledge back and forth?
Right. I think that depends on who and how, right? So we're seeing a move to things like chief digital officers. We're seeing the greater role of sort of the digital service and digital first as policy. And a chief science advisor or engagement and outreach staff. Those are all interesting mechanisms, and I'll speak to some contextual knowledge of that we used to do that in rural policy development. We had rural extension offices that were very, at least in Ontario, were quite successful in terms of that community outreach and facilitating what's happening on the ground when we're talking specifically about community embedded experience and knowledge. And a lot of those extension officers worked quite closely with the agricultural colleges, with the University of Guelph out of Ontario here. And there was a strong relationship between that notion of rural extension. And this is based out of a lot of interesting things that are happening, I think, still. I've heard of some really great stuff happening out of Oregon and out of Michigan State around extension work. But when we lost the rural secretariat and when we started moving away to this more generalist knowledge or generalist model of policy development, we lost a lot of that, right? It was inefficient to have a lot of people out in the field in community offices. It was deemed an inefficient spend of resources. Then we start talking about the relationship between chief science advisors and engagement inside government versus outside government. As a recovering civil servant, as somebody that worked, inside government for the first decade of my career, there are things you can and cannot do as a civil servant that you have a different level of freedom to engage in, or questions you can ask and things you can pursue when you're not inside government. And so that is an interesting role to have, and the idea of a chief science advisor strikes me as one that would always be walking a very fine line between, that notion of fearless advice and loyal implementation, as well as that feedback loop around what happens when the people you're giving that advice to don't implement the best research evidence. How do you negotiate that? What do you do? So there's some inherent tension around there, which I see a really strong role, and a stronger role will be, I think, this coming towards the end of this week. There's a webinar based at SFU about the role between communities and universities. And I think there's a really strong role there for academic researchers to play in that intermediary space. So I don't have any research on that in particular, except for some tangential stuff around what we're seeing grow and experience. My interesting note on that and observation from the literature and around kind of the development of how rural policy is made in a Canadian context is that sometimes we have to go backwards. I think if we look at some of the work that was being done in the 50s and 60s around extension and ag reps and all those things, that we might find that a lot of the tools that we think are brand new right now are things that we used to engage in that we got rid of, and that maybe need a little bit of a polish or a relook to say, what worked out of this and how can we move it forward?
Great. Just a tiny little tidbit to add on to that. This was before my time. About 15 years ago, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador actually had a chief innovation officer, which I believe, again, a bit outside my current knowledge, but I believe the role of that was Allison, the capacity that you indicated. We no longer have a chief innovation officer. Not that you should necessarily read anything into that, but it was something that was considered a priority close to 15 years ago. As of now, my knowledge or understanding is there's nothing of that title currently in our provincial government.
It's a tricky line to walk, right? When we and that's another one where when we look at the big P, political will, as playing a big role in what offices are established and who has what access in terms of those positions. When we talk about rural policy, it would be very interesting to see the effect of the placement of the Minister of Rural Economic Development being within the Ministry of Infrastructure. And what that does to priorities and the way in which policy is developed. I think it's something we sometimes don't pay enough attention to, is where policymakers are located when it comes to rural policy. And I know you and I, Josh, we have, for everybody else observing Josh and I nerd out about this on a regular is you know, in the Ontario context, the Ministry Rural Affairs has been in and out of the Ministry of Agriculture and Food like at least a dozen times in the last 20 years. It feels like, probably that's a bit of an overstatement, but that's what it seems like. And in other provinces, you know, you see the move of rural policy into forestry and mines, or into municipal affairs, or into any number of other portfolios. And the where things are located plays a very powerful role in the kind of people that are attached to the development of rural policy and what their priorities are going to be in the development of that policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very telling, I think. Another question we have is, do you have any observations about the shift in how community organizations apply evidence in their organizational policy changes and the roadblocks they hit when trying to move that shift into a public policy realm? Do you have any success stories or big lessons learned from failures?
Right. So in my previous life, some interesting parts of it, there's some examples that have come out around sort of micro and macro examples of this are things like open data are an interesting policy channel. The open by default notion is an interesting thing around what you can do organizationally, say at the municipal level, versus the challenges you run into on a broader policy level of doing those things on a as you move within jurisdictions. So things that are very successful tend to be micro level changes that just make people's lives easier, right? So when it comes to something around open data policy, something that's been really interesting is that the largest consumers of open data are other public servants or other jurisdictions of governments. So by provincial agencies opening their data, it just means you don't have to go through as many layers to get that data from your colleagues as you would ordinarily have to before. And the same goes across jurisdictions, right? Between municipalities and the province and the feds. Now, in terms of success, this is great. It means that you can access data from different organizations that you need in order to make better decisions. This is, you know, this is supposed to be evidence. The flip side of that is, however, what kind of data is getting put into those open data portals? Do we know that we're publishing a lot of stuff? We're publishing a lot of quote unquote evidence that we could be using, or data at the very least. And it feels good to do it, but is it the stuff that people actually need? Is it the data that that the public or the academics would use? Is it something that's actually shifting things? And the biggest example that I can think of a failure in that response is that postal codes are not open data. You have to, I think they cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $15,000 to buy the set of postal codes. And when it comes to research, that's a tremendously valuable coding mechanism, right? To be able to sort things geographically by postal code, or line those up, or just be able to associate that with things. And so we kind of have policy working at cross purposes there, right? Why do postal codes need to be proprietary to Canada Post? I don't know. No one's been able to actually answer that question for me. So I think that the roadblocks that happen are when we're kind of giving with one hand and taking with another, where we're using mechanisms or policy mechanisms. Remember, going back to that point of what we do and do not do, to say this is a priority, but is it really? When it comes to smaller organizations, a lot of the effective ways that effective ways and roadblocks that those organizations, community organizations, can do with their policy relates to things like listening to your members for the most part, and effective engagement and participation through those mechanisms, and coming up with structures that allow that participation in a more formalized way. When we talk about encouraging broader participation, some of the biggest successes we've seen is a reframing of digital engagement as actually being just as valid as in-person engagement. So including tools like social media or polls or surveys or the opportunity to participate in a webinar as being just as valuable as showing up to a meeting in person or offering your comments on a written-in card. Those lessons are really important because they shift the way we value who's contributing to this process.
That's great, Ashley, and I think I could go on actually about the value that I personally place in public disclosure of certain information, and certainly from an evidence-based policy, whether it's community organizations, whether it's researchers, I think there's a lot of value in that, and I think we actually see that as a priority from OMAFRA. They're interested in moving the needle for research on that as well, which is a very positive, I think, recognition of the value of that for sure. Another question we have is, did you see any interesting differences between the provinces in terms of the responses you heard?
Totally. So I'm based in Ontario, which is probably not a surprise to anybody. And the difference in jurisdictional size between the folks we talked to in Ontario versus Prince Edward Island creates a whole new layer of things, right? When you have a much smaller jurisdiction where you have kind of an office or capacity that might be more comparable to a large municipality in some regards versus a provincial agency in central Ontario or southwestern Ontario. Certainly that difference is very interesting when you're talking about organizational capacity that might be, like I was saying before, across the whole MAFRA industry, 80 some odd policy analysts versus a dozen in different portfolios is really, really interesting. And that speaks to a few things: geographic size, resources available, all those historical structures that happen. But the most interesting observations were not necessarily from the different jurisdictions, although I should note perhaps one of the most interesting differences, the difficulty I had in locating people to talk to in British Columbia and in Alberta at the time. I think I had a few leads in Saskatchewan, but really struggled to nail down some of those interviews. And some of that could have been due to nobody wants to talk about evidence in July and August. They want to go talk about the beach and different more fun things. Some of that is that finding an avenue to find the right people to talk to when we're talking specifically about rural policy is incredibly challenging if that capacity is shifting within the province, if they're, we know there were some contexts where that portfolio was a big question mark for a time. So locating those people was challenging. But the most striking differences tended to be between folks that would consider themselves policymakers, I would say, like on, if you were, we talk about the rural urban fringe, this would be on kind of the research government fringe. These would be people that kind of lived in some sort of intermediary liminal space between the two, that had a foot in policymaking on the government side, maybe through advocacy or had previously worked in those roles, but had advanced education or had another role related to research, versus folks who had been career policy or career research, right? And those differences in terms of just your level of experience and your ability to speak both languages created a really interesting difference around the way in which people thought about evidence, the way people thought about accessing evidence and what it meant, and what it meant for them personally in their role.
Great. And I have one final question here before we wrap up. But I mean, by all means, if anybody has anything else, I mean, we can chat all day, but I know time is running near. But this one is from Anna from Iceland, and she says, "Hi from Iceland. As you were presenting, I thought about the role of universities and academics who are now busy writing peer-reviewed articles which policymakers do not read. I find that the university sector needs to be more connected with the community and be an active partner in the discourse. What is your opinion?"
I agree. So we, I mean, not to just give too simple of an answer there, but I think there's a whole lot wrapped up in that. That's a whole other webinar. But is this notion of the things that we value on the tenure and promotion side for researchers in terms of scholars and how we advance them through their careers versus the things that are valuable to communities and public policy creation often work at odds with each other. So things like, for example, public funding bodies like a Tri-Council funding grant, publications in peer-reviewed journals are the end-all be-all in terms of recognizing scholarly accomplishment or what's research promise versus publications in policy-oriented documents or gray literature or presentations like this one, a webinar or a community workshop. Those are kind of considered quote unquote low impact on the scholarly side of things, even if they have the greater impact or the most impact in terms of motivating scholarship into actual creation of tangible outcome. Now, in the Canadian context, this is really interesting to me that, the vast majority of our universities are public institutions. I consider academics at these places public servants. The work we are doing, we should be making available to the public. It should be easily consumable in a wide variety of ways. Peer review is still very important in terms of validating findings. It's very dangerous to just sort of say anything that gets published through whatever mechanism must be true. That's not good. But the idea that we can reimagine that discussion through things like open scholarship and open publishing, that we can maybe take back the notion of peer review from something that we do to fund large publishing bodies versus something that we do to ensure the scholarship is rigorous is something that's very intriguing to me. And on a final note, something that's worth taking a look at is the fact that the University of Southern California just severed its contract with, I never say this right, but Elsevier, probably one of the major academic publishing companies that creates a major paywall. And they basically said, we're done. This is not okay anymore. So you have the largest public university in the States essentially saying that they're going to look at different ways for making research evidence available to people and publishable. So I think that we're on the cusp of that sea change around how we're going to do that. But it speaks to, again, the need for different knowledge translation tools. And there are a wide variety of things available to us. There's nothing saying that it has to be boring either. It doesn't have to be written down. Podcasts are incredibly useful. The Rural Roots podcast does a really great job of telling stories that often find their way into policymakers' discussions. Tools such as community workshops, community events that are fun and interesting that kind of capture people's imagination are also possible for certain things. And I think the wider our imagination is around how we do knowledge mobilization and get information in the hands of decision makers, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think I agree with everything that Ashley mentioned, and I agree with what Anna has indicated here. I think there's certainly different pockets where the university sector does a reasonable job engaging with the community. I think the structure, similar to as Ashley just discussed, in terms of moving forward in a university context, certainly values those peer-reviewed aspects, and that there's actually been cases of colleagues that I know that were employed at a university that are interested in doing community engagement that actually took a job at another campus or another university because the value of public engagement there was better than their current institution that was very much focused on moving the academic needle per se. One thing that I would like, one final note that I would like to mention, though, as Munzaline mentioned, part of my work is working with industrial development and industrial benefits, and I think there's a lot of work that we can do better in terms of I think if you talk to communities across the province that host, and this is I'll tie this in a minute, but if you talk to communities across the province that host industrial development or mega projects, they'll say that, you know, they could always get more from the company or what have you. I think the community needs to really understand what it is that they want from this as well. So, okay, the University of Guelph, located in Guelph, this is just hypothetical. Guelph wants more from the university. Okay, well, what does that look like? Like, what is it that you want? Do you want um, workshops or engagement sessions or what have you? So I think it's easy to put the blame on the university sector to engage with the community, and there's plenty of that to go around by all means. But I think um, advocates asking for this really may sometimes need to do a better job at defining their actual expectations for, um, I guess, university engagement or whatever the capacity might be. So,
I would agree, Josh, and I think that's the next place where I'm hoping to go with this research is to look at that feedback loop around, okay, so in the cases where you've had government agencies ask for a particular thing for research to be created, that it's been funded or whatever, what have they done with what's been produced, right? So I think that that's the next level of question of if we're asking for particular things, if we're saying, okay, these are the ways in which it's the loop is breaking down, or we need more of this or we need more of that. What happens when on the researcher side those things are created, but then what happens to it? Is it being used? Is it going into policy, or what's happening with it then? I agree with you as well that there tends to be a little bit of criticism. We're not doing enough, we're not producing enough, or we're not producing the right thing. And in certainly a lot of cases that's true, but in some cases we're producing incredibly effective tools that just aren't being used by the people that said they wanted them. I think that whether that's the community, government agencies, or whatever. And I think that that's a pervasive question across a lot of areas, right? When we talk about any sort of engaged scholarship, it's a really important thing worth asking. So I think that's a really great place to go with the next set of questions.
yeah, and I think it's an excellent segue to wrap this up. But stay tuned for part 2 of this webinar.
If you want to be more depressed, yeah.
Yes. Oh, this has been really useful. We actually before we go, there is one final question that I did want to make mention of. Madison just asked if there's any thoughts on aligning policy, practice, and research in rural policy making.
Oh, that's the dream. I think that that's certainly I think something that we see happening in very strong ways in a variety of sectors. So I think that we're seeing that happen in a stronger way in agricultural policy. And I think there's space for that to happen in rural policy. Now, what we have to do is really convince broader jurisdictions that engaging in aligning effective policy and practice and research means that statements related to rural, remote, and northern can't all be just one line in your infrastructure document, that it's its own thing worth questioning. And I think that that's starting to emerge in certain areas. So my thoughts are like, yes, please. And if we want to jam more on that, I'd love to, because I think that's a really, that's the ultimate goal.
I think as rural policy scholars and fanatics, I mean, ultimately, I think we all strive for that. And, you know, maybe today, maybe all of the federal budget will be going towards rural economic development. Who knows?
A girl can dream, Josh.
Yeah. Absolutely. In any case, thank you all for coming. I think we had an excellent discussion, excellent dialogue. Please, whether it's via type or clapping in front of your computer, thanks for Ashley to present some of this research today. I think it's very informative and very, as I mentioned, very timely for our provinces here in Canada. And so we look forward to hearing more about the next parts of this, and hopefully we can have you back on again and hear a bit more about what you have up your sleeve. So we are approaching we are well into the federal budget discussion right now, so I don't want to keep anybody who is chomping at the bit to learn about that. But again, thanks so much, and be sure to stay tuned for the recording of this if you're interested in checking that out.
I would like to once again thank you, Ashley, for your great presentation. It was very informative. I would also like to thank you, Joshua, for your participation, and as well as the audience for their participation in attending this webinar. If you guys have anything to quickly add, Ashley or Joshua?
It's been great. Thank you for hosting me.
It's been great. Thanks for coming, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Alrighty, have a nice day, everybody.
Thanks.